Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second session of Halton Catholic District School Board Parent Information Series. My name is Jane Atchison.
And I am Glenda Brown.
I'm the acting chief social worker at the school board, and together Glenda and I are going to introduce this session to you tonight. The mental health and well-being team at the school board has worked to create 6 information sessions for parents and guardians because we know that the pandemic has been difficult for all of us. Some students have done really well in the learn from home model, while other children have found it really difficult. Some students have preferred to be in the school buildings, but they found masking and social distancing to be quite difficult. Other children prefer to be at home, but then they feel lonely and they miss their friends. Our intent is to share information with you over the course of 6 information sessions that will assist you in supporting your child's well-being. We know that there have been some tough times, and we want to support you in supporting your child. I'd like to center ourselves by starting with a prayer, and then we'll do a land acknowledgement. So if I can ask you all to please join me in the sign of our faith. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. This prayer is called Slow Me Down by Orrin Crane. Slow me down, Lord. Ease the pounding of my heart by the quelling of my mind. Steady my harried pace with a vision of eternal reach of time. Give me in the confusions of my day the calmness of the everlasting hills. Break the tension of my nerves with the soothing music of the singing streams that live in my memory. Help me to know the magical power of sleep. Teach me the art of taking minute vacations, of slowing down to look at a flower, to chat with an old friend or to make a new one, to pet a dog, to watch a spider build a web, to smile at a child, or to read a few lines from a good book. Slow me down, Lord, and inspire me to send my roots deep into the soil of life's enduring values, that I may grow towards the stars of our greater destiny. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Now do our land acknowledgement.
Each of us has a relationship to the natural environment, the land, water, earth, the habitat, and ecosystems. Land acknowledgements provide us with an opportunity to offer recognition, respect to the original inhabitants of the regions that we live in and work on. There are many things that we can do to go beyond simply reading a land acknowledgement script. To make it more meaningful, we need to consider that we are, in fact, acknowledging not only the ancestral lands, but also the historical and complex intersections of settler impacts on Indigenous histories, economies, ecologies, livelihood, well-being, and governance structures. A territorial acknowledgement is not an endpoint in the journey of reconciliation. Actions create conditions for true reconciliation and create a foundation for restoring, renewing, or developing a new relationship with Indigenous peoples. For hundreds of years, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Attawaddaron, the Potawatomi, the Wendat, and Lenape nations have sought to walk gently on this land. They assisted the first European travelers to this territory and shared their knowledge for survival in what was, at times, a harsh climate. Under consultations from elders, knowledge holders from the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and 6 nations of the Grand River Territory, the Indigenous Education Advisory Committee, along with Halton Catholic District School Board, created this land acknowledgement.
Halton, as we know it today,
is rich in the history and modern traditions
of many First Nations and the Métis.
From the lands of the Anishinaabe
to the Attawaddaron,
the Haudenosaunee,
and the Métis. These lands surrounding the Great Lakes
are steeped in Indigenous history.
As we gather today
on these treaty lands,
Our Catholic social teachings call us into solidarity
with our Indigenous brothers and sisters.
to honor and respect
the four directions: lands, waters, plants, animals, and ancestors
that walked before us.
All these wonderful elements of creation exist,
gifted to us by our Creator God. We acknowledge and thank
the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation
for being stewards of this traditional territory.
Good evening and a warm welcome to everyone again. I'm Glenda Brown, the Chief of Mental Health Programming, and I work alongside Jane Atchison, the Acting Chief Social Worker, and Oliver Friese, the Chief of Psychology, in the delivery of mental health supports for students here at HCDSB. We have a wonderful and very talented team of social workers, child and youth counselors, and psychoeducational consultants and psychologists who will present each week on topics that are important to you. We are thrilled to have you join us tonight, and we hope that you will tune in each week to participate and view our parent caregiver information sessions. The chosen topics related to the needs of parents and caregivers that are identified on this slide are the result of consulting and seeking feedback from administrators through surveys and consultation with SEAC, our Special Education Advisory Committee. The topics presented over the course of these sessions will include mental health, anxiety, parenting during the COVID-19 pandemic, raising a resilient child, and ADHD and sleep. Please note that last week's presentation on mental health and well-being during COVID-19 has been posted on the board's website, which allows you to view at your own convenience. Enjoy tonight's presentation.
So today we want to thank Sarah Bust and Rhonda Crawford, who will present to us on the topic of student mental health and anxiety. As Glenda said, the presentations are posted on the board's website. At the end of each presentation, there's a list of resources that you can access, so you can do that at your own convenience. I hope you enjoy the presentation. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Good evening. Welcome to our session on anxiety and children. My name is Sarah Bust, and I am a school social worker with the board.
Hi everyone, my name is Rhonda Crawford. I'm a school social worker here at the Halton Catholic Board. I primarily work in the elementary panel, and we are super excited to be talking about the topic of anxiety tonight. And on the heels of the presentation that was presented last week on mental health and well-being, we all know that we fall on a continuum of mental health, and where anxiety falls for our kids is something that we are excited to be talking about tonight. So coming to you live from my computer, I guess, I'm just going to call up our presentation and get things started. All right, Sarah, do we have closed captioning on just to make sure?
We do.
Fantastic. Okay, so tonight's topic is on anxiety, and what we wanted to talk about is, to provide people with a little bit of a perspective around anxiety as being on a continuum. And if we know mental health is on a continuum, we all sit somewhere along that continuum, as I said. And anxiety is a bit of a normal feeling. And we've all had that feeling of nervousness or that feeling of dread. But where that impacts our functioning may differ. Anxiety is really a common emotion for school-age children. And over the next half an hour or so, we'll be having a bit of a brief conversation about what anxiety can look like for our kids, and maybe provide a bit of a general approach to supporting kids who may be struggling. The reality is that, we need to learn to understand and cope with anxiety, because it is something that we have to learn to live with. It's a life skill, and inevitably we'll be put in situations where we can't avoid that feeling, but we're still kind of expected to perform or cope. Like that job interview or addressing conflict with an employer. And for kids, it could be, attending school or making friends. And as adults and parents, some may wonder, what do kids have to be anxious about? What do they have to be worried about? They're just little ones. And that may be a fair statement when you think about all the stresses and worries that we as adults have to manage. which can get pretty big. But when we step into the world of our kiddos, we sometimes can realize that they experience many worries and fears, and some may be rational and some not so rational. You know, kids are really learning how to navigate the world, and they're learning about what is safe and what is not safe. And so adults, we've already learned those life lessons. And it's really our kids that may be, you know, trying to figure out what that world looks like. You know, they may be afraid of the thunder, or they may be afraid of animals. For school age kids, they might be, you know, talking about, you know, a fear of having robbers come into their house. These are all things that has helping them understand the world and how safe they are in it. So, you know, without further ado, I think, you know, this video is really to help highlight some common anxiety indicators for kids. And we know that some of those indicators might teeter on atypical worries or exceed the norm, so to speak. But it's really about when we look at the child's coping or impact on functioning, that gives us the best information about if anxiety is something to be concerned about. So without further ado, Sarah, I wonder if you can just start us off and talk a little bit about what anxiety is and give us a sense of what that might be for our kids.
Absolutely. So let's just start with a baseline understanding of what anxiety is, and then let's work from there on how to help our kids. So anxiety is our body and our brain sending us messages to help us stay safe and be prepared for things that are coming. Throughout human existence, anxiety has helped us keep safe and survive. Anxiety is normal. It's our body's natural response to stress. It's an alert system to threat that is an unknown, and it's our natural defense system. Anxiety can be helpful. Think of a presentation or butterflies before going on stage. It's our body's way of getting us fired up with adrenaline, and it's pumping, and it can enhance our work that we need to carry out. And anxiety can be problematic. It can get in the way from us being able to function in our day-to-day lives. Take, for example, that you as a parent, you're going in for a big meeting with your boss, and you prep for the meeting, you get ready, and then you chicken out while meeting with your boss, and you have worries and your fears get in the way. So some fears and worries might be legitimate, but when they prevent you from doing things that you normally want to do, then it's a problem. For example, a kid may really want to be able to go to a birthday party, and they may say they want to be able to separate from mom and dad, but when it becomes a problem is if they are not able to be separated from parents, even let's say in grade 6 or 7. Again, we're talking pre-COVID times. One of the things that's important for us to know about anxiety being normal is that we all respond to situations of perceived threat in different ways. And we talk about that as our fight, flight, and freeze. This is our body's way of responding to stress. So you may have heard of this before, but let's just go through it again, just so we have a baseline understanding of how our bodies respond and what we do in response. So fight is that feeling that you want to overcome the aggression, the fear or the threat, the perceived threat through aggression. Take, for example, a kid who has to go to sleep at night. Now, you as parents may have experienced your kid who then resists going to bed. The child may actually be anxious because they're worried about having nightmares or monsters. You say, it's time to go to bed. Your child fights you and says, I'm not going to bed. And they get angry, they get agitated, their body might become tense. They might actually physically fight you. They might become verbally aggressive. So this is a fight response to the threat of possible monsters when they go to bed. We also can have the flight response. People see danger and their body and their mind responds with, I'm out of here. Take, for example, a student or a child who's in a mall or a crowded place. They may see too many people and they perceive that there's a threat. They say, I'm out of here. This might be the child who cowers behind your leg, or they may say, may I go to the vehicle or to the car? You may have noticed that your child doesn't like to be in the grocery store, or even as an infant, they might become more agitated or cry more easily when they're in crowded places. The feeling is that this is unsafe and I must get out of here. So your body responses might include restless legs, numb body, dilated eyes or averting or darting around with your eyes, fidgety, tense, or feeling trapped. And then we also have the freeze response. And this is when you become immobilized by your fear. In kids, this might happen when they go to the front of their class, and they need to present, and they clam up and they're unable to speak. Some of the body responses could include feeling cold, numb, heart racing, skin is pale, clammy hands, or even a slowed heart rate. When we think about our thoughts, feelings, and actions, really there's a triangulated kind of connection between our worries and fears, and we look at that through a triangle. We could have a thought that is rational or irrational. So for example, if we looked at a dog and we see a dog and the thought is the dog is lovely. Nice dog. The feeling is makes me feel warm and elated. I might be happy to see a dog. Dog's tail might be wagging. And the behavior might be I go over and I pet the dog. If the thought is that the dog will bite me, the feeling might be fear, scared, worried, and the behavior might be crying, might be get me out of here, cowering away, and avoiding the dog. So really what we want to look about is we want to think about how there's this real connection between our thoughts, feelings, and actions. And anxiety really has four main components to it. There's a physiological, a cognitive, an emotional, and a behavioral aspect. So if we look at the physiological, we know that there's physical symptoms that happen when we're having an anxious thought or feeling. So this might be, that your heart rate increases, your heavy, deep breathing, or this ongoing chronic symptoms like stomach aches or headaches. An emotional response is, we normally respond to it or commonly label it as fear or possibly anger. And often it can impede our ability to express positive emotions. We also have a cognitive aspect of anxiety. So the thought patterns start to develop where situations are internalized as anxious and provoking signals to the brain that there is a threat. And these neural pathways for anxiety can develop and be difficult to reshape. And then finally, behavioral. And kids sometimes don't have the language or the skills to articulate their emotions or thoughts, but they often show us in their behaviors. And behavior is language. And especially in kids, we know that their behavior is telling us something. So one of the first signs of a child managing anxiety is possibly avoidance, and maybe they're coping in other ways. And it makes sense that if it's something that makes them feel bad, that I avoid it because it doesn't make me feel good. So this interferes with the ability to engage in other developmental milestones like learning, friendship making, or making change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sarah, when you talk about behavior, that link between fight, flight, or freeze is really something that is interesting when we look at coping with anxiety as indicators. To go back to that continuum of mental health where we're all on the continuum, there's also a continuum of anxiety responses. If anxiety is a normal emotion that we all have, some of us learn to adapt and have adaptive responses and to sort of manage it, and others may have maladaptive responses, right? So kids, like you said, don't have that sophisticated language skill to sometimes be able to articulate when they're feeling anxious, or what thoughts. They may not be able to express what thoughts are causing them to feel worried, and sometimes they may be afraid or even lack that awareness to even be able to explain what they're thinking or feeling. So this idea of behavior is often how kids communicate is really something to look at and investigate when we're talking about anxiety for our kids. Because sometimes it can be present as subtle or it can be very dramatic, right? And if we understand our body's response to anxiety is in that, fight, flight, or freeze reaction, it makes sense that we look at that as common indicators or ways of coping, although maladaptive at times for kids, and it can be categorized under those responses. So, coping can be adaptive and helpful to your point. And this is when it's within those normal ranges and it doesn't interfere with developmental activities or milestones. They might be able to embrace that as a normal emotion and become more productive, like the kid who doesn't complete a work task and procrastinates. And so there's some avoidance because they don't want to get it done. But some of that anxiety can be kind of embraced. And that's that adrenaline rush to help them sort of push to get the deadline. So those are the kids that sometimes stay up for longer than they need to get that project done. Other times it can be really maladaptive and unhelpful. And it's maladaptive because that's when the stressors and the anxiety becomes bigger, right? So that kid that we just talked about who might have procrastinated on a project or whatnot, when they become anxious, instead of getting mobilized, they immobilize and they might freeze, where they might become overwhelmed and shut down. And then that affects relationships because a teacher may be disappointed they didn't meet the target, or the parent may be upset because they didn't submit the project. So as you can see, behaviors can kind of be categorized under that fight, flight, or freeze response, and there's an level of adaptation and maladaptation that can occur. And so, maybe it's helpful to take a look at what anxiety can look like at home and at school along that continuum, because there are different ways that it shows up at home, and then there's ways that it starts to present itself at school. Sarah, can you talk a little bit about what it might look like at home?
Absolutely, for sure. So there's lots of different ways that kids tell us that they're struggling with anxiety. And by no means is this an exhaustive list. And parenting at any stage is always challenging, and kids don't come with a manual, right? So sadly, when our kids are born, they don't come with a manual and say, Kid X, this is how it, works. But one of the things that we can start to think about is, are we hearing some of these concerns at home? So psychosomatic complaints are really those body responses, right? So it might be that you're hearing about some headaches or some stomach aches or some, leg cramps or different pieces of their body. Absolutely check in with your family doctor about whether or not this is legitimate. I would never want to undermine that. However, if you're noticing a headache sort of comes on Monday through Friday, and on Saturdays and Sundays and holidays, there doesn't seem to be a headache or a stomach ache, it might be that your child is trying to tell you something else about what might be going on for them. Right. So you can validate their pain, and you can say that they're actually, I'm sorry, your tummy really hurts. But you might want to push through. So one of the strategies that I often talk about is even things like if a kid wakes up with a stomach ache and they kind of, oh, I've got a really bad stomach ache, is, okay, let's try some breakfast and get dressed and sort of, just distract them a little bit around some of the normal activities that might happen in a day. And see if they can push through a little bit. Another thing that happens is that sometimes kids have big worries, and it comes out through what I call the what ifs. And this is when kids start asking questions about things like, what if it rains? What if I have a supply teacher today? What if my best friend isn't there? What if I don't have anyone to play with at recess? What if, and it kind of spirals. It starts to gain momentum, and they start to ask more and more what if questions. And you might be hearing that at home. And their what ifs are legit worries and legit concerns that they have. But again, it's about how you interpret those and how you respond to those. But it also is indicative that they might be having some big worries or big concerns. I worked with a little guy a number of years ago, and he used to obsess about the weather. And he was very concerned about snowstorms or rainstorms or any kind of precipitation. And he would look ahead to the forecast. And so his what ifs were always at night. He was, ruminating and concerned about what was the weather going to be like and how would he get home from school and what if there was a storm and all those pieces. So again, how parents were responding. But that's where it got really big. You might hear about your what ifs as little things. And by no means does that mean that it's going to turn into something bigger. The other thing is that we really know that anxiety equals avoidance. So this might be things that normally your child would engage in. So take pre-COVID example, when you're having a big family gathering, you might notice that your child is no longer engaging with their cousins or their peers or their family members, and they're trying to avoid those situations. Or they might just cling to you, or they might be very avoidant of even doing things that they normally might enjoy. So this might be things like if your kid's a hockey player or they're a soccer player and it's time for team practice or for tryouts, you might hear them saying, I don't really want to do that, or they start avoiding those kinds of things. So really, parenting doesn't come with this manual. Like I said, it certainly doesn't come with a magic wand. And it's really concerning when we start to hear about some of these things. And alone and in isolation at home, they might not be a concern. But we also know that sometimes we see some of these things carry over into school life. And so Rhonda, I don't know if you don't mind talking a little bit about what are some of the common anxious kinds of behaviors or things that we might see or hear at school.
Sure. I think when we look at school, there are different ways that it shows up in different developmental ages and whatnot. But there are some general themes that we often see where we see kids becoming a little bit more anxious and having more difficulty coping with school. We see it, one, in terms of their behavior, we see it in terms of academics, and we do see that carryover avoidance. So for example, irritability directed towards friends, teachers, or parents, maybe that's that manifestation of that fight response. It could also be that silly kid who acts out as a means to avoid a task. For those kids, friendships may be difficult, because they're easily frustrated or misinterpret cues. They might be feeling on edge. This can often lead to conflict with peers or inconsistent friendships. And sometimes, those kids who are struggling with these friendships may be withdrawing as a means to cope because they're not feeling good in those relationships, and so they choose to avoid. Fairly often, academics are often impacted. Anxious kids will have difficulty focusing on school or struggling with mastering new tasks. We find kids who are managing anxiety, they may be consumed with physical symptoms or cognitive thoughts and worries that might be distracting them, For those kids, they might look distracted. They might not be, they might be a kid that we see as not listening. But, one of the things that I want to say is that these are the kids that are actually focusing a lot. They're just focusing on managing the anxiety, and they're not necessarily focusing on the academic piece. So it's really worth noting that when I work with anxious kids, I see them putting in tremendous amount of effort to manage focus at school. The effort is often in managing that anxiety, which may be invisible to the adults around them, right? And what we as adults acknowledge as effort is often that kid who sits and focuses, who starts a task and completes it to finish. And so when kids are not doing this in a timely way, like other kids within their developmental cohort, we might be labeling that as, the child is not trying hard enough because we know they have the potential, or they're giving up easily, when indeed they are actually doing their best. So often I hear kids say, I'm really trying really hard, miss, or I'm working hard, but nobody believes me. And the difficulty is that they can't express what it is that they're doing or what they're trying. Sometimes it's hard for them to find the words because their efforts are not necessarily reflected in an academic outcome. And then this impacts self-esteem and confidence, and it also then impacts, relationships with caregivers and whatnot. So, I think that that's an important point, where academics is often a place where you see a disconnect between potential and achievement. The other piece is what Sarah kind of highlighted as well, is avoidance. So I want to highlight that, absences from school is a prevalent indicator of anxiety. As a flight response, we as human beings want to avoid what makes us feel not good. We want to eliminate what makes us feel not good. And sometimes for kids, that's avoiding school or things at school. And so this becomes an unhelpful or maladaptive strategy, because avoiding school is something that is not always feasible. And so the anxiety gets bigger because they're forced to go into an environment where they're struggling. And so if we start to see absences starting to accumulate, it may indicate as something that's being bigger. I think, it might be helpful to talk a little bit about, and I know that Sarah talked about those 4 domains that sort of get impacted when we have anxiety in terms of the cognitive, behavioral, emotional, and physiological. And when we talk about strategies as an approach, it's important to understand it from each of these domains, because we can kind of marry how we respond, to anxiety to how we would be able to manage it. So Sarah, I wonder if you could cover off the physiological piece and maybe some of the cognitive pieces that, we can use as an approach to managing anxiety.
Absolutely. So when we experience anxiety, our bodies feel it, right? So we actually feel it in our bodies. And before we can actually attack all those thoughts and feelings about it, we really need to calm our bodies down. And there's lots of ways that we can do that. And so let me walk you through a few of them. By no means is this exhaustive, nor is it prescriptive that if you do these things, it will work. Because some days they do work and other days they don't work. And that can be really frustrating as a parent, but we can model for our kids some things that we can do. And I want to also highlight that these are really simple strategies. Mm-hmm. They almost sound too simple. They almost feel too simple. And while it might feel too easy, I invite you to give it a try, because I have found even in my own parenting life that they do work, but sometimes it feels so simplistic. So just give yourself the freedom that they feel really simplistic. And one of them is actually just deep breathing. And I say just a little tongue in cheek because it's really important. So we know that when we're heightened and we're angry or we're upset or we're feeling overwhelmed, that taking the time to breathe, real deep breath, is really important. So like when you had a little infant at home and you maybe laid with them on their bed or you rubbed their back or you modeled for them, I invite you, when you have a child who's, playing that what if game with you, or they're, doing some of these psychosomatic complaints, that you sit down and you say, let's do some deep breathing together. And so deep breathing is not just this sort of hyperventilate, like just breathe, not like that. But instead, what we want to do is we want to teach our bodies to calm. And so, I tell families to actually do it this way, where you would breathe in for 2, 3, hold 2, 3, 2, 3, and again, in 2, 3, hold 2, 3, 2, 3. And already, as I'm talking to you and I'm presenting, my adrenaline's pumping, right? My own anxiety is going. Already, I can feel the tips of my fingers feel differently because I'm taking deep breaths. So I invite you to do that with your kids. Spend some time doing that. You might look at some of the various apps that are available. There's a Calm app. I know there's some different, you might use some relaxation music. You might find an app where there's some meditative kind of stories. So these are all ways that we can get our bodies to calm down and physiologically respond to the anxiety that's sort of going through our bodies. And then cognitively, we can also start to approach and find ways to sort of manage these thoughts and feelings. So again, it sounds really simple, but it's about some of the positive self-talk, right? So, you know, kid says to me, I never get picked to go to a birthday party, or I'm always left out, or, you know, and really it's helping them reframe and also do the positive self-talk. So, you know, yeah, sometimes you're right, you do get picked last, and that must feel really rotten. You know, I wonder if there's going to be a time where you aren't picked last, or is there a time where you have been invited to a birthday party, or is there a time where you haven't been left out? And really, you know, it's helping your kid reframe the messages. So sometimes we can be guilty of saying the always and the never, right? So I always get picked last, or I never get to give my answer first in class. And so rather than saying the always and the nevers, really we're exploring the evidence. And this is sort of, you know, in CBT, we talk about, in cognitive behavioral therapy, a strategy that's often used in anxiety and depression. We talk about detective thinking, or exploring the evidence, right? So I invite kids to explore that evidence. You know, has there ever been a time where you were not picked last? Oh yeah, there was one time. Or have you ever had a time where you've been invited to a birthday party? Well, yeah, there was that one time. So you're really trying to tease out, you know, the evidence around, has there been an alternative reality at different times? And, you know, those cognitive discussions are really important. And I don't know about you, but parenting in this day and age, it's busy and it can be really hard. But when you invite your kids to have those discussions early on and you teach them these strategies, it can be really helpful, because as that skill is mastered between you and your child, that skill will also be mastered for them, and they'll be able to start to do those strategies on their own. Rhonda, how about you talk a little bit more about the emotional support? Because I've started to talk about it a little, but there's some more particulars about that, and I think you're quite good at explaining that.
Yeah, you know, I actually, it's interesting, because when you look at the cognitive approaches and the physiological approaches, sometimes you can't really engage a child into those conversations or those strategies until we've really connected with some of their emotions. So one of the things that I often talk about with families and with my own kids is looking at anxiety aside. One of the most successful strategies to helping children is really to help them regulate feelings through validation, because it isn't until they're validated will they be able to sort of connect with those other strategies and skills. So the most powerful relationship skill is validation. It can really be impactful in offsetting those emotional escalations. And, you know, to your point, Sarah, it's so simplified. These strategies are really quite simple in sort of diffusing some of that anxiety that kids face on their day-to-day. So we can often underestimate how powerful it can be to help kids regulate. For example, you know, that kiddo who's nervous learning about, you know, swimming. And we hope we get to swim soon as the summer weather starts to turn around, but they might resist going to the pool. They start to protest. They don't want to go. They might tell you that they are afraid to drown, or they might die. And these are responses you might hear. But as adults, we might say, you know, oh, it's nothing. And that's a typical response we might have, because we know the chances of them dying is very low, right? Don't worry, you'll be fine. There's a lifeguard. You're not going to drown. It's all going to be okay. And this is definitely things that we might, as well-intentioned adults, do to reassure our kids, because we know that they're not, the worst thing is not going to happen. But for an anxious child, these can feel like you're not listening and you're not understanding. And unfortunately, when this happens, we can sometimes see the kiddo show us in bigger ways that they're scared. Then, you know, that kid who's afraid of the pool might run away. They might hide, you know, flee and avoid. They might even start crying or yelling. They do that fight sort of response. But what they're really trying to do is to convince you how scared they are and that they're really not feeling good. And so in doing this, they become irrational, and that makes it harder for them to soothe. So when we try to reassure a child by saying it's going to be fine, everything's going to work out, it can kind of escalate an anxious child and lead them to more intense behavioral expression of anxiety, which is harder for you guys to be able to sort of support them around because now they are in an irrational state of mind, right? They're all emotion. So validating means connecting with those emotions and maybe finding that kernel of truth in their perspective. You know, it doesn't mean you agree or approve of what they're doing, but it's simply communicating that you understand their feelings and those are valid. So for that kiddo, it might be, I can see that you feel going into the pool is going to be scary, or that you're worried about learning because swimming can be hard. You know, and when we do this, kids can feel more understood. They can label their emotion as a valid emotion, and they can, you know, become a little bit more in a place to be rational, to approach that situation in a more adaptive way. Thinking this might take more than a few times to reassure feelings before a kid can get to that place of calm about talking about how they can cope into a preferred behavioral response. But what I can say is if emotions are left unattended, it can definitely lead to maladaptive behaviors such as avoidance. And then it can then inform those cognitions that Sarah just talked about in terms of, you know, every time I go to the pool, I'm going to be afraid. So that neural pathway of connections kind of starts to get a little bit more, you know, connected and harder to break away from. So validation becomes the way to intervene. I'll touch very briefly on the behavioral piece. Behavioral support and intervention is really looking at when we know it's normal to want to avoid things, avoidance is the way to sort of cope. And so behavioral support is a way to alleviate some of those behavioral sort of responses. And for example, if you're afraid of a small enclosed space like an elevator or taking the stairs, instead you might, you know, feel less anxious in taking the stairs, but in that you are also learning that things that make us afraid is to be reinforced. So we don't want to reinforce that fearful thinking around avoid an elevator because it is a scary place, or avoid an escalator, which oftentimes kids might be afraid of. So, you know, taking the stairs is a way of avoidance. So exposure becomes a strategy to sort of alleviate that. So, you know, and this goes for big worries as well as, you know, worries like an elevator or an escalator. So it involves gradually and repeatedly entering a situation so that you feel less anxious. You start with situations that might be small and cause you a little bit of anxiety and kind of work your way up so that it becomes more manageable. And those feelings, those intense feelings that you have physically, and emotionally are not as intense. And we want to practice that breathing while we're doing it. And we want to have repeated exposure, because the more repeated exposure you have, the more apt you are to be able to be successful. I think, you know, when we talk about the behavioral, the physiological, the cognitive, the emotional ways that we can kind of sort of support, you know, establishing predictable routines and a predictable plan for kids helps alleviate anxiety for kids, and that level of what to expect when there's an unknown with anxiety is something that helps alleviate some of those behavioral responses as well. Just before we wrap up, because I know we're turning tight on time, I do want to sort of reinforce the idea around how school and family and community can kind of come together to support kids. You know, there's two reasons why we want to marry school to home and also bring in the community partners if there's a role for them to play. Because one, understanding what we're seeing at school is also helpful to understand what we see at home, and bringing those together. So that understanding is important, but also how we can work together to reinforce strategies, because the more consistent we are and the more predictable we are in reinforcing strategies and supporting kids at home and school, that home to school connection, the more likely kids will be able to sort of navigate and develop adaptive behaviors and responses to their anxiety. So that's pretty much all that I had to say about that. Sarah, I wonder if do you have anything to add around that working together piece around homeschooling and community?
Yeah, I think you summarized it really well. I think the only other piece is that sometimes parents downplay the information that they might have, you know, and they might not see it as valuable or necessary for the school to know. So, you know, for example, if grandma is really sick, or grandma had let's say she even had a house fire. And so, yeah, that's private information, and that's, you know, pieces going on at home. But it might have an impact at school, because maybe the next time we do a fire drill, that's going to be really important for us to set that kiddo up for success. Maybe we're going to tell that kid ahead of time that the fire drill is going to happen, or we might just want to check in and see how that child is doing. So sometimes I think parents assume that schools don't necessarily want to know, or that they're, going to use this information against us. And I think really schools want to be a connection and a bridge in between. So, I suggest to parents, just send a little email off to the teacher or communicate to the teacher through a note and let them know. And it might feel very minuscule or sort of, again, very basic, but it might be very helpful for the school to be able to plan accordingly. And increasing that dialogue and that communication with home and school is always helpful and in the best interest of your kids.
Yeah. Totally, because we know that kids are not going to learn if they're sitting in that anxious brain. If they are preoccupied with those worries, they're not going to feel good. So making those connections can help sort of bring that kid into that learning brain so they can actually be successful at school and be successful with the relationships at school. So communication is very helpful in being able to sort of bring kids to a place where they're feeling good about school and able to cope with some tough situations that they may be exposed to. So, we just want to leave you with a few resources that you can sort of engage if you have any questions or concerns, or if you have any worries around the indicators that you might be seeing your kids. Certainly your teacher is somebody that you can speak with if you're seeing some of these things that we just talked about. But we also have the Reach Out Center for Kids. We have Woodview Child and Autism Services, and we have the Kids Help Phone that you can also access at this time. So just wanted to leave you with those sort of resources and invite you to sort of engage your teacher if you have any questions or concerns, and we do hope that you've found some of the information here as helpful. I know it's been a lot of information in a short amount of time, and certainly, we could do full courses, 3-day sessions on anxiety and what it looks like in our kids. So we hope that we've given you a little bit of nugget of information so that you can inform, your parenting practices and work in collaboration with schools from this perspective. So thank you so much for your time.
Yes, thank you again, and have a good evening.
Have a nice evening. Bye-bye.
This concludes Rhonda and Sarah's excellent presentation. On behalf of the team, I want to sincerely thank Rhonda and Sarah for bringing their vast experience and professional expertise regarding anxiety and how it relates to mental health, for helping us to understand that we all experience a certain level of anxiety and how to help our children cope when they are experiencing stress and anxiety. Hopefully you found this information useful and supportive to you and your family, especially during these challenging times. This was the second of 6 sessions, and this recording will be posted, as previously mentioned, on the HCDSB public website for you, so that you have an opportunity to watch it again if you would like to. Next week's session topic on April 7th is Parenting During the Pandemic, Fostering Hope, Resilience, and Positive Mental Health and Wellbeing. This next session actually complements and supports tonight's presentation quite nicely, so we hope to see you again. So again, thank you so very much for joining us this evening. We know how busy everyone is, and we hope that your time spent with us tonight has been helpful and enlightening. It would be very much appreciated if you could take a few minutes to provide feedback regarding tonight's presentation. We have included a QR code to provide that feedback. For those of you who are not familiar with QR codes, you simply open your phone camera on your phone and hold the camera in front of the QR picture. Once your camera zooms in on that code, you will receive a feedback survey. You can do that now while the QR code is on the screen. So many thanks to those of you who do complete the survey, and please know how much we do value and appreciate your thoughts and feedback. So have a wonderful evening. We wish you all a very blessed and happy Easter this weekend. Take good care and enjoy that extra day and the long weekend. Good night on behalf of the team.
Good night.